Hi there. In this video, we're going to go over an introduction to Carl Jung's structure of the psyche. My name is Christopher, and my coaching business is Humble Fox Consultations. Now, with that being said, let's dive right into it. So, most of this information was gathered from Carl Jung's autobiography, Memory, Dreams, and Reflections, which I definitely recommend checking out. And then also Jung's Map of the Soul, written by Murray Stein in 1988 as well. And so I also wanted to shout out my professor at Pacifica Graduate Institute, Dr. Jorge de la O, for giving us this structure of the psyche and helping me to really understand Jung's map of the psyche a lot better. So if we were to fill in that blank diagram that I just showed you, this is essentially what we have. And we're going to go over each one of these parts individually, but this is just a good overview of Jung's map of the soul. And this is a very basic overview as well. Because it can become a lot more complex. And Jung obviously wrote volumes upon volumes about the psyche. And so I just want to acknowledge that this is a very basic structure, but it really helps to understand. So just a quick overview. On the top level here, each one of these red lines represents a different part of the psyche. So the top part is the conscious mind, or the part of our mind that we have access to consciously. The second part is the personal unconscious, the part of our mind that our conscious ego does not have access to with our knowing. And then we have the collective unconscious, which is a deeper part of the psyche, which is a part of the psyche that we'll get into that all of humanity has access to, but as you can see, our ego doesn't. So within the psyche, you'll see that each one of these shapes has a hold in different areas. So the ego here has a hold in the conscious mind and the personal unconscious. So even though it is mainly rooted in the conscious mind, it does have access to the personal unconscious. The shadow, which we'll get into more about what the shadow is, has access to the conscious mind, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. Same with the anima or the animus. It has access to all three levels. And then we have the self archetype, or the image of the self, which is a circle in the middle that represents access to basically everything here. And what's interesting about this is you also see that the anima and the animus are is not connected to the shadow in any way, but they are connected to the ego. So even though they don't have direct access to each other, there is a possibility or an arc of communication that can be established through the ego. And also to acknowledge, down here we have the archetypes as well. And we'll get into what an archetype is later in the video. And let's start off nice and easy with some of Jung's quotes here. So Jung said himself, "I haven't the faintest idea what psyche is in itself." And he also says, "Psyche is not a fixed structure. Stay away from concrete models of the mind." Now, Jung was an extremely intelligent man and one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century and of pretty much all of human history in regards to understanding the mind and the psyche. And when he says that he doesn't have the faintest idea of what the psyche is in and of itself, I think that just helps to humble us a little bit as we enter in and literally talk about a fixed structure of the psyche, which is what he says to avoid. Mainly because we don't have another way of understanding the psyche, because that's how our analytical mind works. And so to understand, as we're talking about this, that this isn't a fixed structure, even though that's what we're going to be presenting. So with that little heedance of warning, we have a fixed structure here. So psyche, and this is the Greek word here, is a word that means soul. And many psychotherapists do not realize that the title of the name that they carry means soul healer. Psychotherapy sort of has this idea that it's all about the mind. And psyche, soul is a word that carries weight to a lot of individuals due to religious trauma and different backgrounds and upbringings. And so soul may be a word that is a little bit more difficult to comprehend. So we're going to be using the word psyche to understand this, but just know that psyche is a Greek word meaning soul. And so here are the qualities of the psyche. So the psyche is paradoxical. The psyche does not make rational sense. It is amoral. It works off conflict. It is timeless. It's outside of time. It desires to be known. It desires transformation. It carries its own intentionality. Psyche is real. It wants balance and wholeness. And the idea of individuation is the psyche in development. And that is sort of Jung's whole idea of what psychotherapy is sort of this idea of moving towards individuation. So psyche is experienced through emotion and the symbolic. The psyche consists essentially of images. That's one of Jung's quotes. And so that's sort of just an overview and a general snapshot of what the psyche is. And now, as we dive a little bit further, we can start picking apart each part of the psyche. So here on the outside, we have this yellow rim, and that is what we're going to be called the outer world. And that is everything that exists outside of our bodies. And we experience the outer world through our five senses. The outer world consists of places, energy, things, people, and it's everything that's outside of the body. It's what's out there. And so that's what we're going to be calling the outer world. Now, in order to interact with the outer world, our psyche has developed what is known as the persona, or the outer mask. So this is the part of us that actually relates to the outer world. And so when most people speak of their ego in a way where they're sort of self-blaming their ego, like, oh, my ego's getting in the way, or when my ego's in control, I don't really like who I am, or saying phrases that sort of bash on the ego, what they're really saying in Jungian psychology is that when my ego identifies with my persona, I don't enjoy who I am. And so when the ego identifies with the persona before awakening into the understanding that we are more than who we think we are. And the persona is the part of us that is who we think that we are. So when our ego identifies with our persona, that is essentially what we get when we have people mentioning those comments of my ego is bad. And the ego is not necessarily a good or bad thing. We'll get to that in a moment. But just understand that the ego is not the aspect of persona. The ego has access to the persona, but the persona is its own thing. And the persona is actually what is known as a complex. And one aspect of a complex is that a complex is autonomous, meaning that it is running on its own to some capacity. The ego has its own ability to control parts of the persona. And for instance, a way I like to look at the persona is sort of how we interact with energy that is coming towards us from the outer world. And so when I'm interacting with somebody, my persona is the thing that is making my facial movements recognizable to another individual so that they can understand what emotional state I'm in. My persona is also what's relating to the external world. It's the aspect of who I am that makes small talk as well. So when somebody says, "Hi, how are you doing?" And I say, "I'm doing well. How are you doing?" That's the persona. It's sort of like this automatic, sort of rote and scripted way of relating to the external world. And it's autonomous because the ego can't be spending that much time trying to think about all the little things that it's doing with the external world based off everything that's happening within the brain at any given time. So the persona is given some autonomy and control of itself in order to relate with the external world, but the ego still has access to the persona. So this is from Stein's book. Taken psychologically, the persona is a functional complex whose job is both to conceal and to reveal an individual's conscious thoughts and feelings to others. As a complex, the persona possesses considerable autonomy and is not under the full control of the ego. So once again, the persona has a mind of its own. It has its own wishes and agenda. And we'll talk about how the persona is formed in just a moment. Up next, we have the ego. So, ego is a word that means I am. And the ego sort of has this, there are many different ways that the word ego is used. It's originally developed in Freudian psychology with the id, the ego, and the superego. And that's not the model that we're discussing in this. We're talking about Jung's structure of the psyche. So, the ego is more so like the center of consciousness. The way that I see the ego is sort of like this ring of light that we can like see through. It's like this amorphous blob that is moving through the psyche, and it's how we can place our awareness on different parts of who we are in the body. It's the part of us that is accessing awareness in a way that is directing focus and is choosing between what is important to need to know in this moment. So it's the center of consciousness. The ego is a kind of mirror in which the psyche can see itself and become aware. So it's the way in which we can look at ourselves. And that's how we develop the unconscious, is because the parts that we cannot see of ourselves thus become unconscious, inaccessible to our conscious mind. And so Stein says, Jung understood and described it, the ego, is morally neutral and not a bad thing. And I want to emphasize that because it's very easy for people to shame their ego or to say things like, oh, my ego's getting in the way. And that's just shaming the ego. The ego is a tool for us to use, and it's not getting rid of the ego that we become more individuated. It's in learning how to use the ego as a tool and to strengthen the ego. We actually, in Jungian psychology, want a stronger ego so that it can tolerate more unconscious material that is coming through. The ego is sort of like this membrane that is allowing unconscious material to come to the surface. And the stronger ego we have, the less rupture we have when we allow deep unconscious unprocessed material to come to the surface, which ultimately needs to happen for the process of individuation. As one hears, it is referenced in common parlance, oh, he's got such an ego, but a necessary part of human psychological life. So it's like I mentioned, it's not that phrase, oh, he's got such an ego, which sort of is like this idea of like this sort of narcissistic personality disorder, or somebody who thinks of themselves very highly, which for whatever reason we have shame towards. It's more so of this tool, of this aspect of the psyche. And so one goal of psychotherapy is to strengthen the ego. The ego needs strength in order to process unconscious material. So remembering that. And now we're going to talk about the shadow. And shadow is a word that's really thrown around a lot in new age circles. And I want to just get a little clear about what we're talking about when we talk about the shadow. I'm going to take a quick sip of my coffee here. So the shadow relates to the persona. And we'll get into that in a moment as well. But the shadow is all of the aspects of who we are that don't fit into our persona or our outer mask. And our persona was developed through traits that were admirable, rewarded survival mechanisms or deemed lovable by our caretakers in childhood. So how we show ourselves to the world, those aspects that don't get shown to the world fall back into the shadow. And it's important to understand that they are still there. So a lot of individuals who I work with end up not being able to show anger very well. The parts of ourselves that get angry, it's very common in therapy to have to work with individuals to help them to be able to become angry at somebody in a healthy way. And so our ability to have anger gets put into the shadow. Anger is not necessarily a good or bad emotion, but if we deemed it to be bad or unworthy of love at some point, we put it into our shadow to hide. And something important to understand is that even though it's called the shadow, it's not inherently evil. However, evil or the ability to hate may be in the shadow, which is just a natural human drive. The shadow, even though it's called the shadow, is not a bad thing. The shadow is just the unwanted parts of our persona that is then split off and put into the shadow. And so what's interesting about the shadow is that we have these white or golden parts of our shadow as well. So you may have heard of the term of golden shadow or white shadow. And so what that means is that we have maybe taken good aspects of ourselves and placed them in the shadow. I hear individuals all the time who say, I'm not really an artist, or I don't really sing. And to me, that breaks my heart to hear that, because we're all artists and singing is a natural human expression. I'm not really a dancer. At some point, we were maybe shamed for authentically expressing those parts of who we are. And because of that, we placed these aspects into our shadow. And so it becomes our work or our shadow work to go back into our shadow, not only to reclaim those aspects of ourselves that we deemed bad, but to also reclaim those aspects of ourselves that may actually hold truth of our authenticity inside of it, of our authentic expression of who we are. Marianne Williamson actually has a quote about how we are not actually scared of the darker parts of ourselves. We're actually scared of our own light, and our own light may be put in the shadow because if we were shining too bright as children, somebody may have shamed us, a caretaker, a teacher, another friend. And so it's our job to go back and to reclaim those parts of ourselves. A good indication of shadow integration is not changing who you are based on the situation. And so what we're doing there is we're integrating the split of that aspect that we left behind into who we are now. And so if you go into a room, you may notice this with other people, that when they're around other people, they may change who they are in a way. And we may notice that we start doing that as well. We all do that to some extent. And one indication of integration of the shadow is not changing who we are based on the situation, but learning to integrate all aspects of who we are based on every situation. So the way that these relate to each other. Oh, so here's another quote as well. If a person completely shuns the shadow, life is proper, but it is terribly incomplete. By opening up to shadow experience, however, a person becomes tainted with immorality, but attains a greater degree of wholeness. This is truly the devil's bargain. It is the Faust's dilemma, and it is a core problem of human existence. In Faust's case, his soul is saved in the end, but only by the grace of God. And so what he's saying here is that even though it is amoral to go back into the shadow and pull those out, we have to do it in order to become more whole. If a gang member learns that compassion, vulnerability, love for humanity are not qualities that are appreciated by the gang, he's going to put those in his shadow, and he's going to have a more vengeful persona. So his integration process would be to actually reclaim his love for humanity, his compassion, his sense of gentleness for himself and for others. So just to acknowledge that the shadow is not good or evil, it is the direct opposite of the persona. And so that's what we're going to talk about here, is the relationship between the persona, the ego, and the shadow. So these all relate in a very particular way. So back here we have the shadow, which is inner desire driven. It's what we truly want. Whereas the persona is what the world wants from us. So we place what the world wants from us on the outside so that we can be good boys and good little girls, but we have the shadow, which is what we truly want and who we truly are as well. And then we have the ego, which facilitates the mediation between those two. And the thing about the shadow is those inner drives don't go away. They will find a way to come out, but it's going to be shady. It's going to be manipulative. It's going to be in ways that even our ego doesn't want to own or have access to. And so we have to acknowledge that those parts exist and bring them out and have conversations and dialogue with those parts to understand how we can meet those needs that our shadow is requesting of us. So persona and shadow are usually more or less exact opposites of one another, and yet they are as close as twins because they are a mirror in essentially. The shadow is who we really are, and the persona is who the world needs us to be. And that happens in early developmental childhood. Here we have the anima and the animus, which is a little bit more complex to understand. But in Jungian psychology, the anima represents the feminine aspects within the male psyche, and then vice versa, the animus would be the male aspects in the feminine psyche. It includes qualities such as receptivity, emotion, intuition, and the nurturing side. And I want to be inclusive here of non-binary individuals as well. So when we talk about this, what we're essentially saying is whether we identify more as masculine or feminine, or even if we identify as non-binary, to understand that whatever we exhibit to the world, the opposite is what is going to end up in the anima and the animus. And that is going to be based off of our own personal process, that that masculinity is not a rigid structure and femininity is not a rigid structure. It just so happens that the opposite of whatever our predominant energy structure is going to end up in our anima and animus. It's how we're going to relate to the other world. So, for instance, in individuals who identify as men who are predominantly masculine, they're going to have a feminine anima. And that anima is going to be a archetypal structure of woman or feminine energy. And what that means, we'll get to in a second, but I also want to iterate the animus here as well. So conversely, the animus represents the masculine aspects within the feminine psyche and embodies characteristics like logic, assertiveness, and rationality. So with the feminine side, we have the receptivity, emotion, intuition, and nurturing side. And so what's wild for a lot of men that I work with is that typically they don't have access to that feminine side, which is the emotional side, the feeling side, the intuition side, and the nurturing side. And so our objective in psychotherapy or in working with these particular clients is to actually help them to access feeling states and to help them to access those deeper parts of who we are through intuition and through access to the anima and the animus. And the anima and the animus is a complex, once again, which means it's autonomous. It has its own desires, wishes, drives, wants. And with this, it's important to understand that on the flip side, just because a man has a masculine identity and identifies primarily with masculine energy does not mean that he also needs to integrate logic, assertiveness, and rationality, right? As we've sort of moved away from this sort of very dichotomous way of looking at the world as masculine and feminine, we realize that everybody has these qualities. Some have strengths in particular areas and some have weaknesses in others. And maybe it doesn't necessarily have to do with who we identify as a human being, but it can. So wanting to acknowledge that as well. So the anima or the animus is an archetypal figure, meaning it is universal and symbolic representation of the feminine or masculine. It is not a specific person, but a collective, timeless image. So this is how we relate to women in the collective, what this image of woman is, what this image of man is in the collective unconscious. As you can see with the anima and the animus, we have access to these different realms. So it has access to the conscious mind, the personal unconscious, the collective unconscious. The anima or the animus to Jung was actually a messenger between these aspects. So it gave the ego the ability to have access to the collective unconscious through its use. So we relate to the collective unconscious through the anima in a way. And so it can be seen as a messenger between the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. So let's talk about archetypes. So archetypes, this is actually what I wrote in one of my papers, and I'm just going to read this so we can get a good definition. We can dissect it in just a moment here. So archetypes, however, were considered to be existing layered on top of or within the collective unconscious. Defining and understanding the archetypes can be rather slippery, akin to grasping water. Even in Jung's own writing, he discusses that archetypes are controversial and more than a little perplexing. One way in which Jung described the archetypes is that they are guidance from God. In the Jungian school of thought, one may regard an archetype as a kind of mold for the accumulation and discharge of psychic energy. So the way that I like to talk about archetypes when I'm explaining them is that like archetypes are blueprints. They are sort of a natural way in which energy conglomerates within the psyche. And I kind of like to think of it like snow falling. That when snow falls, it sort of lands as it does due to the natural laws of gravity and the way that things are affecting the way that the snow falls. Same with archetypes. Archetypes have rules, they are bound to the laws of nature, and they are collective energy patterns that sort of crystallize in particular ways. And they are accessible across all of humankind. They exist down here in the collective unconscious. And so these are the archetypes in potentia. And I'll show you an image in a second about what I mean by that. But these are the archetypes in potential, meaning that they're ready to come up. So a couple aspects of archetypes is that they are innate in all human beings. They are the origin of thoughts and must therefore in some way come before those thoughts. And so what that means is that we all have a very similar way of thinking, but that may become different and more personalized as that thought basis moves through the collective to the personal to the conscious mind. They are the very thing that makes humans human. So they are the myths, the stories, the poems, the meaning that comes with being a human being. And once again, they are collective, meaning that they are in every human. Human thought evidences some sort of systematic categorical structures, similarities at a deep level. That's kind of what I mentioned earlier, is that we all have the same way of thinking in some way. And that's why myths are so powerful, because they show the way in which our collective thinks. And once again, as that thought moves up through the different layers of the psyche, it becomes a little bit more individualized. And so this is a great image of the archetypes in Potentia. So down here, we have the collective unconscious, the bottom of the psyche. And as you can see, they start moving up based off their laws of nature, and they move up in a way up to the conscious mind that follows the laws of nature. So at the bottom of this lava lamp, we have the archetypes slowly moving up, then disintegrating, and then returning. And so we can see sort of how the thoughts may work in the psyche. I think the lava lamp is a cool way to show that. So the self archetype, this is the big shebang. So Jung would define the self as in and as relationship with the eternal and the transcendent. And so what we're trying to do here is describe the ineffable. And this self could be called the image of God. Maybe it's to you the Atman, a higher power, or a sense of wholeness in the psyche. It is the conjunctio oppositorium, which is the union of opposites. So it's when we have those two opposites, it's when we have the union. So good and evil, or light and darkness. It's the wholeness that encapsulates both of the opposites. And so the reason I wrote paradoxical wholeness here is because wholeness actually isn't how we would think of monotheistic wholeness, as in like this one singular point. It's actually in a polytheistic sort of way of thinking, which comes to this idea of flexible ambiguity, meaning that the more access we have to a polytheistic worldview, that we have many parts and that we're very flexible with ambiguity and navigating many different parts of the psyche and recognizing all of those different parts, that we are closer to wholeness than if we are to try and integrate all those parts into one self. It's in recognizing that we have a lot of different parts, and that's the paradox of this self, is that it's many. It's the many that make up the whole, and the whole that makes up the many. One way of looking at this, the self is not the I. The I is the ego, and the ego is being dreamed by the self. And the I, once again, I am the projection and the creation of the self archetype of the unconscious. So the I is the projection of the self. And that can be a little complex to understand. I don't want to pick apart these images too much. I want to just leave it where they are. If you can just feel the energy of what that means. If God is only light, then you forsake half of your divinity. God is light and also evil. So acknowledging that those parts exist in the world, in God, and in us. This is when Lao Tzu says, all are clear, I alone am clouded. And then this is from 1 Corinthians, love bears all things and endures all things. And so a couple ways of getting in touch with the self. So first and foremost, discover your relationship with and to the self. Not what somebody else says or what an organization says or a church says. This is a subjective experience. How do you personally relate to the self? A couple different ways that you can access self energy are dreams, which Jung believed to be sent directly by the self archetype or God or the Atman. So dreams are God or the Atman or the self directly communicating with you. So get in touch with your dreams, start writing them down, start drawing them, start interacting with your dreams. Active imagination, which was an amazing way in which Jung would interact with his psyche. Art is an awesome way to just sort of tap into that. And then understanding your shadow. So this is a question that I'm going to leave you off with, which is, what is it in you that wants to express itself as infinite intelligence? So if you would like to work with a specialist one-on-one on any of this stuff, I offer consultation and coaching sessions. So if you'd like to schedule a free one-on-one, you can click the link below. I also run men's groups and co-ed groups as well. If you're looking for group process, if you want to work on childhood trauma or attachment or shadow work, dream work, or even just rediscover what your purpose is, I'm happy to explore any of that with you. So thank you so much for tuning in. Appreciate you for watching. If you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing to help this video get into YouTube's algorithm, that would be amazing. And other than that, I will catch you in the next one. All right, take care.